It comes to us to
That's
say.
okay. You can pause the recording as well if
Okay,
you don't.
let's pause. Yeah, thanks. Yes, yeah. All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to our third, is this third this term? Oh my God, I'm losing count.
Thank you, second.
No, except us. No, it's so the third, welcome to the third seminar in the Interrogating Development Seminar Series for the term. Basically, it's a seminar series that's run by the Department of International Development. My name is Dr. Leah. I'm a lecturer in development economics in the department here at King's College London. So typically what we do in these seminars is that every other week we invite scholars who've written new books related to development and or are important thinkers in the field. Sometimes we try to have a bigger panel of conversation going on. Sometimes we just do a book presentation. And the whole idea is to sort of broaden what even development means, because I feel like, again, I'm an economist, so we have a very limited view of what development is. But given that we're an interdisciplinary department, we like to have more robust and interdisciplinary conversations around development. So we've had two before in the term. This is our third one. We have 3 more coming. So once again, please stay in touch for those who want to join our other seminars. Today, I'm extremely delighted to welcome Dr. Iokiñe Rodriguez, to talk about her book, Just Transformation, co-edited with her co-authors, Just Transformation's Grassroots Struggles for Alternative Futures. Seems like a lot of you already know Iokiñe, so the introduction is lost on you, but for those who doesn't, she's a senior lecturer at the University of East Anglia. She's co-founder of Grupo Confluencias, a consortium of Latin American conflict transformation practitioners, researchers, and institutions that work on platforms of deliberation, joint research and training in this area. As a researcher in the Acknowledge project, her work focuses on issues of local knowledge, power, environmental justice, equity, and intercultural dialogue. She will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, if that's okay. And then we will have our discussant, who has read the book and who will get the discussion going. Our discussion today is Samuel Moore, who is a PhD student in our department. His research is concentrated on the interaction between financialization and working conditions in South Africa's mining and garment sectors. His research will investigate themes such as financialization, global production networks, and labor regimes. He holds a MSc in Development Studies from SOAS, and before starting his PhD, Samuel worked on policymaking and campaigning for universal basic income in South Africa at Action for South Africa. How I wrangled Samuel into doing this is because he suggested that I invite you. So that's why he's very kindly agreed to be the discussant today. So once you're done talking, you're gonna get the discussion going. You'll have about 10 minutes. And then of course, we'll open it up for Q&A. There is a wine reception afterwards. I'm assuming this room, they didn't let it, there will be wine. So we can have more conversation after the official time period is over. So I'll hand it over to you. Do you have the clicker? Yeah. Okay, good.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much, Emma, for inviting me.
It's
Yeah, thank you for.
I'm making sure everyone can see. Can you see? Yeah. Yes.
It's really a pleasure to feel that the work that one does can be of interest and use to other people, because we put a lot of effort, as you know, into doing these things with the hope that it can be of use. And this book in particular is a result of a collaborative project involving many people. And of course, as you can see with the camera there, but the co-editors of this book, Mariana and Leah Temper, are not here today, but they're also aware that this is happening, and they're thrilled, as well as the rest of the collaborators and co-authors of this book, which I will let you know who they are shortly. The first thing to say, as some of you have asked, where does this book come from? It is the result of a 3-year research project that extended to 5 due to COVID. And it was part of the first three, as it says there, the first three transformation to sustainability international research projects funded by the International Science Council. Since then, they have had, I think, a second and third round of projects where they're characteristic for being international research projects, think tanks, basically, approaches to thinking about transformations to sustainability from different perspectives. And what caught the attention of the TS2, the Transformation to Sustainability Network, was that the focus of this project placed on environmental justice activism and this idea of co-produced knowledge between academics and activists. And this project was actually, thought of, created in the mind of Leah, who has worked a lot. Maybe some of you know of her work with Martínez Alier from the ICTA in Barcelona on the EJ Atlas. I'll talk about that briefly. It's really her idea originally, and I'll explain how it emerged in conjunction with Ashish Kotari from India, from Calpravich. They both made this project, and then there's a lot of us who participated in different ways in the project. But I want to acknowledge everybody's contribution to this, and of course thank the ISC for their original support to this project. This project has now finished, and however the impacts of the project, as you will see, continue. Continue.
Yeah, you might need to click on that again, maybe it was on the.
Oh, sorry. Are you for the seminar? Come on.
Okay. So an important thing to say is that this is the book that is open access, is free. This is one thing that we made a huge effort to ensure with some remaining funds we have from the project, was to create an agreement with Pluto that we wanted this book to be of free access. But you can buy it as well if you want to. Some people like to read it. And if you buy it before October 24th, you'll have a 30% discount. So hurry up if you want it. So this is the book. If you want to pass it around for those that want to take a look, while I explain it a little bit more. The other thing is that, of course, it's very difficult to have even talk 45 minutes on a project that is 5 years old, long, sorry, and involving so many people. So there is a link there. If you can share the slides afterwards, I would be happy to do that, to a launching of the book that we did as a project. So we, in November the 20th last year, we had an event online where most of the people in the project that could take part, we celebrated the launching of the book, and you would have access to that link to meet, even it's only virtually, the rest of the co-authors from the book. Just to say that, I won't be able to cover in the same with their own voices all the work that everybody has done. So I would like to invite you to maybe have a look at that. So this is the project, how it was conceived precisely as a project that thought to put a focus on how environmental justice movements are themselves experiencing the search for environmental justice, and what comes out of their struggles, how are they understanding just transformations to sustainability. And the whole sort of engine behind this was this idea of co-producing that knowledge. So the idea of activists and academics working together in the understanding of how environmental justice movements think of transformations and what comes out of the transformations. So I'm going to start with a little bit of introduction of my colleagues. So these are the entirety of the co-authors. From, as you can see, it is a team of a wide variety of authors, but also with different characteristics. Not only because we are from different countries, and that has to do with the countries that the book deals with, but also we are a combination of academics and activists. And some of our academics define ourselves as scholar activists. So there's a big combination of activism and academia in different ways. So in this list, you will see, for instance, organizations like Calpravich,
Oh, you have to point to the computer.
Sorry.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry.
You will find organizations like Calbridge and Camille that are activist grassroots organizations. You will find academics like me and many of the people that are there. You will find chiefs, indigenous chiefs like Elmar Ranzai and Anacleto from Bolivia. You will find indigenous lawyers like Vladimir Vilar from Venezuela. And you will find academics that will self-define themselves as activists because have formed part of activism, like Rania Masri from Lebanon. She is an academic, but she actually was an activist in the case study that she systematized in the book. So that's one of the things that I want to clarify is that activism is ingrained in the team in many ways, in many different ways. So this is the team, and in one of our last meetings, it's also intergenerational because a little baby was produced there, Leah's first baby. So since we were together for a long time, we had time even to have different types of outputs, human outputs. So, those are my colleagues and friends. And so to explain where the book emerged from, this is where it emerges from. It emerges from the Environmental Justice Atlas, who I'm sure many of you have heard of. And this is an online tool, an engine created in 2014 by the university, the Science and Technology Environment Institute in the Universidad de Barcelona, in Barcelona, where Leah Temper was doing her PhD with Martínez Alier, and they decided that there was a need they created this idea in their mind that there was a need for documenting how environmental conflicts were increasing throughout the world at the same speed as the expansion of global economy and capitalism. So they wanted to demonstrate the negative impact that globalization was having as a social economic metabolism in the world. So they said, let's set up an interactive tool to document environmental conflicts. And to date, there are more than 3,400 cases of conflicts documented there. I'm not going to go and consult the page because if you want to, the link is there for those that don't know it. How many of you have heard of the EDG Atlas before? Okay, well, the link is there. It is a really fascinating and useful online tool, and it's co-created by users and people from conflicts and together with the people that administer the page, and documenting conflict cases that are basically, in this particular case, related to extractive activities. And the documentation of the conflicts looks at, first of all, you know, why is the conflict there? You know, what are people opposing the project? What strategies people are using to oppose the project, and what are the outcomes if the conflict has led to any possibilities of stopping environmentally and socially degradable and destructive practices. So it has a lot of information, and it's increasingly being used as a database to analyze how conflicts sort of behave. But one thing that wasn't clear when this idea emerged for this project was, you know, okay, we have the conflicts, we can analyze conflicts, but we need to start analyzing, you know, how do the conflicts help to transform injustices? Do conflicts actually help to bring more justice through the strategies? And if so, what are the changes that are happening as a consequence of conflicts? And also, most importantly, you know, what do environmental justice movements want to be transformed? What are their needs? How conflicts and environmental justices can be transformed, the strategies that communities and movements use, and to have some idea of what is the outcome and what is a transformative movement for environmental justice. So this is how our project emerged. So out of the interest to understand, if we talk about transformations to sustainability that have been widely written more from the traditional, more steering governance or technology-driven approaches that put a focus on changing institutions or adjusting governance systems. Because we had all been working with environmental conflicts for a long time, we knew that there is a lot to learn from conflicts as motors of change. because conflicts ultimately are talking about injustices and are trying to contest, confront and change power relations that create injustices. So if we want to move toward transformation, we knew that we need to pay more attention to the role that resistance movements actually have in bringing about these transformations. So it is out of these questions and objectives that this project arises. And these are the case studies that the project ended up having. We had more, but there were some situations where they couldn't, the conditions on the ground were difficult in India, for instance. So we have 3 case studies in India, 1 in Turkey, but it ended up being 2 because the university itself became an area of contestation when the project was in its later stages. And Belgium, in Latin America, we have 2 case studies in 2 indigenous territories. And in Canada and Argentina, we actually have countrywide case studies where we use the Environmental Justice Atlas, the information in the Environmental Justice Atlas to document across the country transformations in how environmental justice movements are producing transformations in the case of Argentina in mining conflicts, and in the case of Canada, it was on indigenous people's territories. So it's very difficult to know how to, what to share in a book presentation, because I don't want it to be a presentation of the project. So, but at the same time, I want you to have I want to give you a little flavor of the book, really. The project has many different sort of things to talk about, but I just want to give you a little flavor of the book, and then you can tell us what you thought of the book that you're reading. It's really nice to have another perspective. And of course, I want to make you curious to go and look for the book, not buy it, but so the book, we structured it in 3 parts, and each one is very, from our perspective, is very valuable. The first part, I'm sorry if it's a bit blurry, I couldn't manage to do this in a way that was more visible to fit it on the page, but the first part of the book has like our 2 more academic contributions. The first one is our explanation of how we conceived and did co-production of knowledge in the project. How do we position ourselves as academic activists, and also how we did it methodologically. And the second chapter is more a dialogue between the 2 sort of frameworks that we developed, which I'm going to talk about, to analyze these transformations, because one of the big challenges of a project of this scale is how to have a common lens to analyze transformations, and there hasn't been, that we knew of at that time, an analytical or some sort of conceptual framework to understand transformations to sustainability through the lens of movements, there can be other framings for other things, but we wanted a framework that could help us understand the role of power, how to evaluate transformations brought about by conflicts, and how to evaluate the transformations brought about by alternatives to development that movements are trying to bring about. So those are the 2 more methodological conceptual frameworks. And then we have a central part of the project, of the book, which are analyzing cases. And the organization of these chapters was complicated, because although each chapter told different stories as well. So each case study told different things, but we ended up realizing that there was a very clear division between cases that were sort of caught in what we call the double movements against state and market, which is movements that try to change power, but again, the force of power in preventing transformation. So how these are in some way where you could say very simplistically sort of failures of transformations, or cases that really haven't really progressed to the point that they could have, because the hegemonic power of the state and markets just sort of prevented the change to happen. And then we have a central sort of in-between cases that are cases that say a lot of interesting things about scales of transformations. So transformations At the individual level, how people are involved in the movements, what they experience individually as a movement in this, and also how they are impacted by the conflict in a complicated way, which is the Belgium case study. The Rijka case study looks at gender and how women are trying to transform relationship of power in pastoral communities in India, and a case in Argentina, as I said, that looks at transformations at a wide scale, institutional transformations in mining, brought about by the movements. And then the last group of cases are what we call a bit more hopeful or transformative, that are producing what we call counter-hegemonic alternatives in the politics, economics, and the worldviews of the systems. And our last part is an attempt to start developing what we call a theory of transformation, with the lessons that we got from the cross-cutting case studies, and then some key takeaways. So I'm going to try to give you a little taster. I can't go into all the cases; it's impossible. The book is there, and I'm not going to talk about the cases in great detail. I just want to give you a little. First of all, a little overview of these two frameworks, because this is a really very important contribution of this book. And what was interesting is the two frameworks that we used were produced by two Global South networks. So this is a really nice case where two networks from one from Latin America and one from India found ourselves doing similar things, and the project brought us together, and we found out how similar what we were trying to do was. And the second chapter of the book tells this encounter, how we found ourselves and what we were trying to achieve with each of our methods or framework. The important thing to take into account from the beginning is, how we are understanding transformations from the bottom up. For what we're saying, and we were as a team from the beginning of the project, we have a very clear positioning about what transformation meant to the team. We're not talking about transformations in the energy sector as such, or transformations in sectors of society. We're talking about transformations, and what we all knew, because from our previous work, that we're talking about processes of injustice and unsustainability that are caused by injustices and violence. So the idea that we need to move to situations where participation, decision-making has to be broader, changes in local communities for sharing of power, things that has been documented and we know because we study international development, but we're talking about processes that are being brought about by communities in the search for that justice. That processes that there's a motor of a collective vision behind trying to make that change, that there needs to be process of emancipation, revealing the root causes of conflicts and the root causes of injustices. And we're talking about the need to really talk about systemic and radical change. We're not only talking about symptoms of injustice, we're talking about the need to engage with the revitalization of relations, the revitalization of cultures, and effectively how movements are themselves trying to contribute to those changes through their own political activities. So this, in a way, this was in the background of these two networks. And we have one network, it's called, as David said at the beginning, it's called Grupo Confluencias, and it's a group of people from different Latin American countries that for a long time we have been working as facilitators in different roles in environmental conflicts in the region. And we had a very long frustration in developing methods, mediation, conflict resolution, what do you call it, agreements that never ended up really creating more justice. So it were just sort of mechanisms used to put out fires, but not to really transform what the environmental conflicts were about. It was through that realization of frustration, we started thinking, we need to think about environmental conflicts through a different lens. And we eventually came across these concepts in peace studies. It's called conflict transformation, which really does a much better role at engaging with the ground, the roots of what environmental conflicts are about. And the center of this approach is precisely power. How to engage with power. And it recognizes and assumes that conflicts are not this negative thing that we have to avoid and, you know, put aside and find really quick solutions to get rid of. We really have to listen to conflicts, engage with conflicts, and use them, and use their catalytic power for change and for greater justice. And so this is the starting point of Grupo Confluencias. We changed from this idea of dealing with, you know, putting off fires to really engaging with power. So we started developing a framework to try to understand you know, what is power in environmental conflicts. And this is not something that we created. This is very well documented in political theory. You will have, many of you have read about different phases of power, as explained by different theorists, but basically there's a very clear distinction in social politics and theory that there are, if there are power relations that are creating oppression, generally speaking, there are three types of power that we have to engage with. One is what we call structural power, which is that power that is embedded in institution, economic frameworks, political frameworks, the legal system that creates conditions for human behavior, right? And that sets the rule of the games and sets the spaces where people can decide, participate in decision making, but it's very well framed. Those are the structures that guide our behavior and our day-to-day practices. But those structures are not necessarily fair for everyone, and environmental conflicts expose the great injustices behind many of these legal frameworks, political framings, economic projects. And so we have to really understand, first of all, communities have to understand that, but at the same time, we have to understand how communities develop strategies to try to produce a change in that sphere of power. And the same with other type of power that's well documented, which is the power of relations, based on relations between in networks and people, which is the relational power, and the idea that people that are in power create networks to remain in power. Right? So we need to change, impact those networks through alternative networks. So how are communities and movements creating their own networks to impact on structural power? And of course, we have the more invisible type of power, which is cultural power, which is the narrative, the worldviews, the knowledge systems that dominate and make people's behavior conditioned to particular normative values. So we started conceptualizing, trying to have that clear. So the idea is that if we want to have a role in helping communities transform conflicts, we have to have a role in one way in strengthening or helping to work through each of these strategies. So from creating agreements for dialogue, we realized that it was much more productive to try to shift our role to a role that we can actually engage with movements in creating strategies to impact on those different types of power. And the next stage was developing, how do we know, okay, communities, one thing is to understand the strategies that the communities are using. The other thing is to understand what comes out of those strategies once communities try to impact on different types of hegemonic power. So we started developing what we call the indicators of transformation, which we've very roughly grouped in 5 pillars, which are, we say that to move towards a situation of greater justice and reduce violence, we have to, movements need to become stronger at the end of that sort of battle. And that is through achieving a strengthening in the cultural vitality, political agency, having greater control of their local means of production, having stronger institutions, and achieving a greater environmental integrity, or ensuring some form of transition to a better environmental integrity out as a result of their strategies. So that was our very, 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 very simplistically, our framing, and then we developed, of course, particular questions to try to guide the analysis of those transformations in each one of the pillars. So for instance, in the cultural vitality and recognition diversity, when we're looking at movements and their impact, we're asking have the struggles helped to recover collective memory and revitalize local knowledge and identities in the movements? That's one of the questions. There are many more. Have institutional and practices that generate exclusion in policy making, have they been made more visible through the struggles? Have counter narratives and counter discourses of development and environmental change emerged as a consequence of the struggle? So we're trying to really unpack what is transformed as a result of the strategies used by the movements. So the indicators and the questions are very long. In the book, there's the whole list, so I won't go into detail, but just to give you a little frame, a little idea. And the Kalprovich group, on their own side, they were really engaged on something similar, but not so much from the perspective of conflicts, but from the perspective of the alternatives that movements are putting into place. And their focus was, they were also trying to develop indicators of transformation, but the transformations that happen as a result of communities putting into practice alternatives to development. And these are the type of alternatives that they knew they were happening in India. So communities having different types of projects for urban sustainability, community-led energy transitions, water management, alternatives for better health, village revitalization, community governance structures that are more equitable, produce local community projects for production, etc. So a wide range of what they called initiatives for well-being that are happening from the ground up. And they were trying to understand if through making those alternatives from the ground up, what were the justice dimensions of that, how just, how sustainable they were. So they were really wanting to develop indicators that could, with the communities, look with them and the movements at the transformations brought about by their alternatives. And so they developed this similar framework, which is interestingly also with very similar categories to ours. They were also focusing on culture, social well-being, economic democracy, cultural integrity, and direct delegated democracy, which is the political dimension. And they also developed their own questions for monitoring or evaluating on the ground transformations that happen in each one of those spheres. So anyway, so that's one of the contributions of the book. For the case studies, it was very useful because we used the different ways, these frameworks, to analyze transformations happening from the ground up. And even today, these frameworks are being used beyond the project by some people that have learned about them. So that's one of the things that the book can be of use, of interest maybe to some of you. And that's one of the chapter 2 talks about those frameworks. And then you see in the case studies how those frameworks have been used to analyze transformation. The other thing, of course, that the book will maybe interest you is in the case studies to really understand what comes out of the movements. And I'm just going to give you a glimpse of three cases. I can't go into the detail of the cases, but I want to explain 3 cases where different alliances or different forms of activist academic relationships took place. One where there was a bit more of a detached sort of perspective, where we used the framework, which was a Venezuela case study, to analyze, to document, systematize historically the evolution of a conflict, where my colleague Vladimir Aguilar and myself in Venezuela, we basically used the framework to look back on the conflict. But it's a conflict that we have been involved with for 20 years, so we know the evolution. We have worked with communities there in facilitation of dialogue and cultural revitalization and political activism. So we knew the case up from back and forth, and we had a long historical perspective. And the second, the Bolivia case, is a much more research action project, where we have been working with them for a long time. And the Argentina case is one of the cases where we use the AG Atlas. And I just need to give you a little sort of story of this conflict, and what happened very briefly. So this is, as I said, one of the conflicts that, unfortunately, what we say its transformative potential was sort of squashed by the state. And it started in 1997 by the Pemon indigenous peoples learning just by chance that there was going to be a power line to be exported to Brazil. without any consultation, as these things often happen, and they started fighting to be included in decision-making, basically. But what this conflict revealed was this big tension between sort of two models of nation state. At that time, Venezuela was what we called was based on the traditional Republican model, the liberal model, which is citizen rights, equal citizen rights to all. Indigenous peoples didn't have any differentiated rights. So the Pemon started fighting not very long in the beginning of the conflict. They realized that the only way they could fight this project was by gaining territorial property rights. But that was not allowed within the framing of the nation state, because Venezuela didn't have any legal system that allowed indigenous rights to have differentiated rights. So this is a very interesting conflict where indigenous movement ended up changing the model of the nation state, because the only way to eventually reach a negotiation for the finalization of this project, which took 4 years of conflict, was by changing the national constitution. And of course, this happened in a moment of political transition in Venezuela. It's not that the Pemon put a President Chavez there and then he changed the constitution. This is part of the political context, but it was a conflict that had a lot to do with maneuvering within the nation state to deal with a strategically important project for the country, at the same time to respond to a very strong political indigenous movement. And this is a case where there have been hugely important legal transformations, but the political context ended up co-opting the indigenous movement, fractioning it, making use of some particular alliances between the state and some indigenous leaders, and making promises for finalizing the project, which were never really responded to strongly. And then the power line has been built. It's a project that was going to export electricity to Brazil. The power line is there, and the Pemon, although they were promised legal land rights after the change of the constitution, they haven't gained political rights for indigenous sort of. They are in the constitution, but there's no territorial demarcation being carried out in this area yet. So yeah, this is just, there's a lot more to this conflict. I don't want to spend the whole 10 hours talking about that, but that's one case in which we see that a very strong political movement that manages to produce transformations demanding recognition of differentiated political rights successfully, resistance, a lot of 12 power lines were pulled down as part of that struggle. That's just one during those 4 years. So there's a variety of strategies, from direct resistance to more negotiations that Pemon used. But at the end, a complex sort of political situation shifts, and then the state manages to eventually enter and introduce a mining law, and now the Pemon have changed from defending their territories to being miners. So it's a complex political phase. Then we have, differently, a case in Bolivia, where the Moncosh indigenous peoples in the central parts of the lowlands there, in Lomerío, have been fighting since the 1980s for control over their forests. And they first gained this by changing the forestry law to allow communities to become to develop community forestry as an economic alternative. Then they gained property rights over the land in 2006, and they have been fighting strongly since the last decade or 2 decades for political autonomy as a project for defending their territories and for defending the vision of the future. And this case is actually one of the most iconic in Bolivia in terms of indigenous peoples developing very organic and systematic strategies to retain control of their territories from external pressures, through impacting again on the political system, but also changing the regulation. So as I said, the first move was to change the forestry law. They had a huge amount of impact in the constitutional reforms in Bolivia, participating in regional indigenous movements to produce changes in the national constitution, to produce a change towards a more plurinational nation state. The Moncosh had one of the leaders from Lomerío was part of the Constitutional Assembly, a woman, an indigenous leader. And so they are, to me, one of the most successful indigenous movements in Latin America in terms of systematically and sustainably, not environmentally, but in a sustained fashion, using the system to gain political rights. What is interesting is that through this, when we carried out, we've been working with them since 2014, and with the Acknowledge project, we offered them the opportunity to evaluate how successful they had been, to put into balance, what they had achieved. We used the conflict transformation framework, we used the power analysis with them to analyze the strategies. And what came out was very interesting, because once they did their analysis of strategies in differentiating between structural, relational, and cultural power, and we put in balance, what they had achieved and what they had lost. What have you lost by doing all this? They realized that although they have achieved a lot in terms of new rights, being owners of the forests, owners of the resources, they still feel that they're losing control of their territories, even with those big achievements. And this has to do with the fact that their enemy, as they call it, has shifted from being the state to now being themselves. Because now that they have property over the territories, they have legal land rights, territorial rights, they have realized that the younger generations and the whole idea of engaging with the nation state has been so strong. The younger youth have moved to urban areas, or urban values. They don't know anything about their territories. They don't know anything about the struggle that their elders did to gain these resources. And so they're losing their language. So they're finding themselves back in fights between themselves on how to govern this territory that now is legally theirs, although it was always theirs, but now it's formally theirs. And now they're finding themselves in a situation of. So what comes out interestingly about doing this analysis of the power is that they came to realize that although it's important, of course, to have done a lot of strategies to change structural power and to engage with the state to gain new laws and changes in frameworks, they also need to work a lot in cultural revitalization in the future now. And so they've had a lot of networks and people working with them, and including us. We do a lot of work on reconnecting the youth to the territories through using photo voice, participatory videos, and developing an intercultural education system for schools on how to reconnect to their knowledge and language. So that's one of the cases that told that story. And there are similarities with the Indian cases in similar things as well. So this is just a glimpse, a taster of what's coming out of the case studies. And the Argentina one, I think, is my favorite chapter because as well, it's a very, very robust chapter in the way that they told a story, how they analyzed the EJ Atlas. They analyzed 38 mining conflicts in Argentina. And understanding one thing that is unique about Argentina is that when the moment they started, they've also been working with mining conflicts, the two co-authors, for a very long period of time, engaged with mining movements, feeding up information to the EJ Atlas themselves and with movements. But what comes out from the EJ Atlas is Argentina is a very atypical case in the success of movements stopping mining activities. So when you look at the EJ Atlas case studies, which are 38 mining conflicts over a period of 20 years or so, 56% of the mining movements, the mining projects, environmental justice movements have managed to stop. So the question was, why? Why is Argentina being able to do this? And what happens in the process of these movements resisting to mining? And what was very interesting is when I started analyzing the institutional dynamics And of course, then the strategies developed by movements in making this happen. And there's a combination of institutional openings through decentralization processes that took place in 1990s, and transferring the power of local plebiscites and environmental regulations to municipal governments, to provincial governments. So environmental justice movements had the opportunity to link directly with their provincial governments to stop mining projects. They had mining project, it was not the central government dictating mining. Of course, mining companies would have an agreement to start the projects, but provincial governments had to listen to local voices. So there was also an opening in the possibility of developing plebiscites to consult locally if communities were agreeable to mining projects. And environmental impact assessments also were done regionally. Communities had the possibility of impacting there. So those were legal opportunities that were opened by the system as the decentralization process, which movements then started using very strategically and connecting within themselves through networks. And there was a knock-on effect of one first mining conflict scale in the south that was very successful in using plebiscites as a tool for consultation, which then became the rule across Argentina. And then using a huge repertoire of strategies from a plebiscite, then injunctions, legal injunctions, to more cultural resignification, what we call in Spanish, strategies that are more cultural, about giving a different value to nature. Well, this is just a photograph of one of the representatives from the provincial government giving to the Pope a T-shirt about the water is more valuable than gold, and resorting to all these sort of more cultural, symbolic strategies. So that's one case. You can read more about it in the book, to give you a little taster of what comes out of looking at cases across scale. So there's a chapter also, I won't go into those, that summarizes basically our main lessons in terms of theory. What are these cases telling us in terms of how transformations happens? And we put a focus on this idea that transformations need both things. We talk about this relationship between conflicts and alternatives. Transformations from the resistance side, so from resistant movements, need conflicts. Without conflicts are the motor of making injustices visible. But there also needs to be alternatives brought about by communities and by movements, because if not, the conflict stays, like in the case of Venezuela. That's a case that didn't really emerge. It didn't sustain itself in time because the vision of the future that the PEMON wanted was not really very well worked with. Then this idea that, conflicts, transformations happen, and the Argentinian case is a good one in terms of showing that multiplicity of strategies that are involved in bringing about transformations. And they happen through alliances, but also through diversity of strategies. There are multiple enablers, some more sort of theoretical, some more maybe academic. It's this idea that there needs to be action, but there needs to be theory. What we have realized through working with movements is that there's often the need to think, understand the complexity of the political system, of the power of what conflicts are, how to transform them, to be more strategic and learn. The movements that are stronger are the ones that actually have thinkers behind all this. Really very, very, and this is quite a thing to develop and to sustain a conflict over time, in terms of all the things that you need to know to engage with power and its complexities. And then, well, there are elements about who are those enablers and what are they, and of course the scales at which transformations happen. The last thing I want to mention are some three takeaways for you guys. Maybe you feel familiar. I said I was only going to give you a little taster of the book. So this is the taster. From our perspective, one of the key things to really sustain transformations, what we learned from this process, was that there is this point about not devaluing the importance of culture. I think most communities, most movements tend to engage a lot with structural power, change legislation, frameworks, economic systems. But we have seen that those cases where more longer transformations are happening are those that are really paying attention to engaging with power, connecting with identity, creating new narratives of development, new narratives of the future. That's really very, very crucial. Then this idea, of course, that we academics have a role to play in helping movements think through. And I think there's this element of co-production of knowledge. There's a lot to learn from the project and from the book. And I hope it gives some ideas for those that are interested in exploring that. And then the last one was that we finished the book in the middle of the pandemic, and that helped. We're not expecting that to happen. I think nobody was, but it really made us see things differently because we first of all we saw new things happening in terms of the advance of development and extractive activities, the taking advantage of territories being quiet and silent, just to the danger of more authoritarianism expanding through the world. And we thought it would actually stop through COVID, but it hasn't. It has become worse. So we have seen our colleagues from Turkey are much more, authoritarianism in Turkey has increased, places like Latin America, it's getting worse. But at the same time, we saw how things like COVID also created solidarity. So we had the fortune of already finishing a project, already being connected. And it was really fascinating to see how communities started, how our co-partners from the local area, different countries, were keen to learn how different community movements or co-partners were dealing with COVID. So we started developing dialogues about traditional medicine used and how people are coping with COVID, but things are, in terms of food and the strategies. So there were new dialogues that happened there. And that showed us that the huge importance of networking in communities, exchanging dialogue and knowledge. I think that's one of the things that this project taught us, is how much communities want to learn from each other and how useful and beneficial it is for them to share their own experiences and learn from each other, which is not something that it's not only, you don't realize this only by looking at cases like the Argentina one, when you know that movements are connecting, but the co-learning that happened across our case studies between the communities was really very beautiful. So I think that's all from me. Just to finish, yesterday, Ashish Kotari, who knew I was coming here today, sent me this little email, which I thought I would share with you, about the transformation of the project beyond the cases and beyond. And I'll just read it quickly. And this is a carved stamp for making fabrics and clothes in India, which I thought was I took it when I went there, one of the visits, because it resembles what he's saying. A brief report back on 2 sessions that he had with the textile students of the National Institute of Design. He's still using this framework to engage with other movements. And he said the first session was on radical alternatives and the alternative transformation framework. They're using it to assist women of the Self-Employed Women's Association, one of India's largest, with 10,000 of mostly informal sector women workers in 8 states, to understand the work of the network along different dimensions. And today they reported on their findings. And this was added by the women. It was very, very interesting as they looked at the multiple transformations taking place in the political, social, cultural, and ecological aspects of life based on interventions relating to livelihoods, so cultural, textiles, food, agriculture, vending, etc. Also, the value and ethics emerging from these transformations. SEWA as an organization said they benefited from this as they saw interconnections that they may have missed earlier or newer depths they could go into the work. And the students felt they benefited a lot from seeing the various intersections along helping them to evaluate their own perspectives and lifestyles as urban residents. And they will continue to using the framework over the next 4 weeks. So just as another insight of how these things are continue to be used by others. That's me. Time?
I'm gonna hand over to
Your turn now.
should go over there though.